Thinking Like a Christian, Understanding and Living a Biblical Worldview by David Nobel, with Chuck Edwards, Chapter 4, Biology. Key question: what is the origin of life? Key idea: science is relearning an old lesson. The more one discovers about the universe, the more one discovers design. Key quote from Dean Kenyon: when all relevant lines of evidence are taken into account and all the problems squarely faced, I think we must conclude that life owes its inception to a source outside of nature. Dean Kenyon. Summary: when it comes to the origin of living systems and the great diversity of life, biblical Christianity maintains that to adequately account for the design observed on every level in nature, it postulates a designer, a lawgiver, an orderly first cause. Christians believe the creationist model as described in Scripture better fits the facts of science than the evolutionary model. Christians trust the authority of Genesis as well as the declaration about creation, such as those in Mark 10:6 and Colossians 1:16. Science and Christianity are demonstrated to be compatible and to declare in unison that God created all things, Ephesians 3:9. The Bible gives us information about God and his universe, while science gives us information only about God's universe. Perhaps no other aspect of Christianity has troubled believers more in the last century than the question of origins. Because many biologists treat evolution as a scientific fact, Christians have struggled to reconcile their faith in the Bible with the fact that man and all living things evolved from a single speck of life. This reconciliation is impossible from a rational perspective. Christians who believe that God created the first glimmer of life on earth and then directed its evolution to generate man, the belief unknown as theistic evolution, must take substantial liberties in interpreting the Bible, and they face most of the same arguments Christians use against atheistic evolution. Jesus Christ declares in Mark 10:6, beginning but at the beginning of creation God made male and female. Theistic evolutionists have, through semantic acrobatics, managed to interpret this verse and others like it so that they appear to support the evolutionary position. Theistic evolutionists contend that the term creation simply means that God created the first spark of life and then directed his creation through the vehicle of evolution. Thus, some Christians believe that the Bible does not necessarily deny evolutionary theory as an explanation for origins. This may appear to be a tenable position when discussing only verses concerned strictly with the question of origins. However, when one examines the entire message of the Bible, the doctrine of theistic evolution severely undermines the Christian understanding of God and man's place in his universe. For example, while it is true that God is capable of anything that is logically possible, so that he could have used evolution to generate all species, why would he employ such an inefficient and often totally ineffective mechanism? If God designed the world to operate according to specific natural laws requiring minimal routine interference, why would he use an evolutionary mechanism that would require his constant meddling with the development of life? Further, such a mechanism seems an especially cruel method for creating man, as Jacques Monod notes. Natural selection is the blindest, most cruel way of evolving new species. More important, if evolution is true, then the story of the Garden of Eden and original sin must be viewed as nothing more than an allegory, a view that undermines the significance of Christ's sinless life and sacrificial death on the cross. Why? Because the Bible presents Jesus as analogous to Adam. The condemnation and corruption brought on us by Adam's sin are the counterparts of the justification and sanctification made possible for us by Christ's righteousness and death. Romans 5:12 through 19. If Adam was not a historical individual, and if his fall into sin was not historical, then the biblical doctrines of sin and of Christ's atonement for it collapse. Of course, this conclusion is unacceptable for the Christian. Thus, it is our contention that the proper Christian worldview requires a belief in the Creator as he is literally portrayed in Genesis. For a Christian to have believed in creation 40, 30, or even 20 years ago might have seemed radical because, until recently, evolution appeared to be unassailable scientifically. Understandably, many Christians turn to theistic evolution as the only means of reconciling their reason with their faith. Today, however, the scientific objections to evolution are so strong that Christians who wish to integrate faith and reason would do well to abandon evolution as a rational explanation for the origin of species. The reason for this will be explained later in this chapter. Christianity and science. The roots of modern science are grounded in the Christian view of the world. This is not surprising, since science is based on the assumption that the universe is orderly and can be expected to act according to specific discoverable laws. An ordered, lawful universe would seem to be the effect of an intelligent cause, which was precisely the belief of many early scientists. Renowned philosopher and historian of science Stanley L. Jackie spec- specifies that from Copernicus to Newton, it was not deism but Christian theism that served as the principal factor helping the scientific enterprise reach self sustaining maturity. Inherent in this early scientific dependence upon the orderliness of the world was the belief that the world was ordered by a divine creator. As Langdon Gilkey points out, the religious idea of a transcendent creator actually made possible rather than hindered the progress of the scientific understanding of the natural order. Modern evolutionists have lost sight of this order. According to their perspective, all life is the result of chance process. This problem of perspective causes many evolutionists to lose sight of the marvels that abound in our universe. Whereas earlier scientists accepted Christianity and therefore were able to recognize the order of their world as a reflection of the Creator's omniscience, evolutionists must now view everything as fortunate accidents, with emphasis on chance instead of cosmos. Creationists understand that the vast order and design in our world points unequivocally toward a designer and creator. Thus, creationists use theology or teleology designed to nature to support creationism. Teleology supports creationism. William Paley presented the most famous version of teleological argument, that of the watch and the watchmaker. Since the 19th century, however, it has been widely believed that Paley's argument for a universal designer was effectively answered by the philosophy of David Hume. Hume claimed that Paley's analogy between living things and machines was unfounded and unrealistic, and therefore that life does not need an intelligent designer as machines do. Hume's reply to Paley caused many people to discredit the teleological argument in all its forms, which also contributed to the willingness of science to ignore design in nature and suggest that all life arose by chance. But science can no longer ignore teleology. Indeed, science has recently discovered that life really is analogous to the most complex of machines, thereby reinforcing Paley's argument. Michael Denton, a molecular biologist, states Paley was not only right in asserting the existence of an analogy between life and the machines, but also remarkably prophetic in guessing that the technological ingenuity realized in living systems is vastly in excess of anything yet accomplished by man. Science is relearning an old lesson. The more one discovers about the universe, the more one discovers design. Many notable scientists inadvertently support Paley's nowadays as they describe the design and nature revealed to them through science. Physicist Paul Davies, who does not profess to be a Christian, supports teleology and ultimately creationism when he says every advance in fundamental physics seems to uncover yet another facet of order. At first, this seems to be an obvious conclusion of little significance, but strict evolution demands chance rather than a lawmaker as the guiding force. When a world class non Christian scientist like Davies declares that the universe cannot be viewed as a product of chance, it's a severe blow to materialistic evolutionary theory. When one truly understands the ordered complexity of life, it is hard to imagine chance producing even bacterial cells, which are the simplest living systems. Denton explains. Although the tiniest bacterial cells are incredibly small, weighing less than 10 to 12 grams, each is in effect a veritable micro miniaturized factory containing thousands of exquisitely designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery, made up together of 100,000 million atoms, far more complicated than any machine built by man and absolutely without parallel in the non living world. As Paley pointed out almost 2 centuries ago, this type of design requires an intelligent mind. Chance processes cannot produce such intricate order. DNA created or evolved. The existence and properties of DNA support creationism both through the teleological argument and by demonstrating evolutionary theory's inability to explain crucial aspects of life. DNA contains the genetic information code and is a crucial part of all living matter, yet evolutionary theory is powerless to explain how it came into existence, let alone why DNA evinces such phenomenal design. This technological quality of DNA is overwhelming. Charles Thaxton believes DNA is the most powerful indicator of intelligent design. Is there any base in experience for an intelligent cause for the origin of life? Yes. It is the analogy between the base sequences in DNA and alphabetical letter sequences in a book. There is a structural identity between the DNA code and the written language. That is, we can assume DNA is the product of intelligence because it is analogous to human languages, which are, without exception, the product of intelligent minds. Even excluding the teleological nature of DNA, its very existence severely undermines evolutionary theory. Walter Brown points out DNA can only be produced with the help of at least 20 different types of proteins. But these proteins can only be produced at the direction of DNA. Since each requires the other, a satisfactory explanation for the origin of one must also explain the origin of the other. Apparently, this entire manufacturing system came into existence simultaneously. This implies creation. DNA obviously presents one of the most pressing problems for evolutionists. It is an intensely complex substance, yet it must be present in the very earliest forms of living matter. How can evolutionists explain this? They cannot. In fact, no one has shown how life itself could arise from non living chemicals, let alone such a complex aspect of life as DNA. This inability to demonstrate spontaneous generation, the development of life from non life, is another key weakness in evolutionary theory. Spontaneous generation. For the atheistic evolutionist belief to be rational, the major problem biology must overcome is the impossibility of spontaneous generation. In order for life to have arisen due to random processes, at some point in time, non living matter must have come alive. Many evolutionists point to the work of Alexander Oparin in defense of spontaneous generation. Oparin describes a theory that supposedly allowed for chance process working in the prebiotic soup to give rise to life. Unfortunately for evolutionists, this theory is rapidly being refuted by science. In fact, the further science progresses, the more unlikely spontaneous generation seems. Dean Kenyon, a biochemist and a former chemical evolutionist, now writes when all relevant lines of evidence are taken into account and all the problems squarely faced, I think we must conclude that life owes its inception to a source outside of nature. He bases this conclusion on four premises. Number one, the impossibility of spontaneous origin of genetic information. Number two, the fact that most attempts to duplicate the conditions necessary for chemical evolution yield non biological material. Number three, the unfounded nature of the belief that prebiotic conditions encouraged a trend toward the formation of L amino acids. And number four, the geochemical evidence that oxygen existed in significant amounts in the Earth's early atmosphere. Organic compounds decompose when O2 is present. Brown also believes the existence of O2 creates an insurmountable problem for chemical evolutionists. If the Earth, early in its alleged evolution, had oxygen in its atmosphere, the chemicals needed for life to begin would have been removed by oxidation. But if there had been no oxygen, then there would have been no ozone in the upper atmosphere. Without this ozone, life would quickly be destroyed by the sun's ultraviolet radiation. Ozone and life, therefore, must have originated simultaneously at the time of creation. The second law of thermodynamics. Another major hurdle for evolutionary theory involves the second law of thermodynamics. In order to understand the clash between evolution and the second law of thermodynamics, we must first understand a few of the implications of the second law. A. E. Wilder Smith explains the second law of thermodynamics states that, although the total energy in the cosmos remains constant, the amount of energy available to do useful work is always getting smaller. This law has important implications regarding the effect of time on the orderliness of the universe. While the evolutionists call for the universe to grow more orderly as evolution progresses, the second law of thermodynamics assures us that the order tends to degenerate into disorder. Wilder Smith puts the contrast clearly. The theory of evolution teaches when all the frills are removed, just the opposite to this state of affairs demanded by the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics doesn't just contradict evolution, it also reinforces the creationist explanation of man's origin. First, it suggests that the universe had a beginning. If the entire universe is an isolated system, then according to the second law of thermodynamics, says Brown, the energy in the universe that is available for useful work has always been decreasing. However, as one goes back in time, the amount of energy available for useful work would eventually exceed the total energy in the universe that, according to the first law of thermodynamics, remains constant. This is an impossible condition. Therefore, it implies that the universe had a beginning. Second, it suggests that the universe began as a highly ordered system. Wilder Smith says the second law of thermodynamics seems thus to describe the whole situation of our present material world perfectly, and the Bible very clearly confirms this description. For example, in Romans 8:22 through 23 teaches us that the whole creation is subjected to vanity or to destruction. Everything tends to go downhill to chaos and destruction as things stand today. The creationist position, then, is more in sync with science than evolutionary theory. This becomes even more obvious when one considers genetics, the gene pool, and the limit to change. Evolutionists believe that no breeding limits exist, since life forms must ultimately break these species barriers to create new species. Indeed, evolutionists see beneficial mutations as breaking all barriers to change, since the mutations supposedly can produce a vast array of structures, even a human eye, given enough time. Unfortunately for evolutionists, however, science simply has not been able to demonstrate that any mutations break these limits to change. Pierre-Paul Grasse, after studying mutations in bacteria and viruses, concludes that it is the use of their unceasing mutations, if they do not change. In some, the mutations of bacteria and viruses were merely hereditary fluctuations around a median position, a swing to the right, a swing to the left, but no final evolutionary effect. If indeed such limits exist, then evolution is a meaningless explanation. If a species can only evolve so far before it hits a barrier and is forced to remain the same species, then no macroevolution occurs. This notion of the gene pool limiting the possible variations of species has troubled a great number of evolutionists, including Alfred Russel Wallace, one of the founders of the theory of natural selection. Wallace grew to doubt his theory later in life, largely because he became aware of Gregor Mendel's genetic laws and could not reconcile the apparent limits to change with evolution's need for boundless development. Increasingly, Edward Debye Jr. also recognizes these limitations and yet remains an evolutionist. Some remarkable things have been done by crossbreeding and selection inside the species barrier, or within a larger circle of closely related species, such as the wheats. But wheat is still wheat, and not, for instance, grapefruit. And we can no more grow wings on a pig than hens can make cylindrical eggs. How can Debye remain an evolutionist in the face of such evidence? How can one believe in virtually unlimited change when limits abound within species? Rationally, one cannot. The creationist believes the evolutionary position is opposed to reason and therefore rejects it. It would seem that the case against evolutionists and in favor of creation is quite formidable. Indeed, retreat appears to be the only option available to the evolutionists. Incredibly, this conclusion seems justifiable even without reference to what many consider the most powerful refutation of evolutionary theory, the gap in the fossil record and the absence of transitional forms. A brief examination of this evidence should leave few doubts as to the bankruptcy of evolutionary theory. Fossil gaps and intermediate forms. So far, each of our arguments has focused on whether evolution is theoretically possible. Now we turn to the question of whether the empirical evidence suggests that it happened. Over 100 years ago, Darwin wrote, "The geological record is extremely imperfect, and this fact will to a large extent explain why we do not find intermediate varieties, connecting together all the extinct and existing forms of life by the finest graduated steps. He who rejects these views on the nature of the geological record will rightly reject my whole theory. When Darwin made this claim, he was correct in asserting that the geological record, as scientists knew it then, was imperfect. Now, almost a century and a half later, it is safe to say that the geological record has been thoroughly scrutinized. And rather than confirming Darwin's theories, the fossils condemn them. One reason the fossil record condemns evolutionary theory is that many complex life forms appear in the very earliest rocks without any indication of forms from which they could have evolved. Creatures without ancestors cannot help but imply special creation, as Brown says the evolutionary tree has no trunk. This explosion of complex life is not the only way in which the fossil record condemns evolution. The lack of fossils supporting the transitional phases between species is perhaps the single most embarrassing topic for evolutionists. And yet, this absence of transitional fossils is undeniable. The fact is grudgingly recognized by leading evolutionist David Raup. A geologist admits the record of evolution is still surprisingly jerky, and ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. The problem for evolutionists unable to produce transitional fossils is made clear by Brown. If Darwinian evolution happened, a fossil record should show continuous gradual changes from the bottom to the top layers and between all forms of life. Actually, many gaps and discontinuities appear throughout the fossil record. An evolutionary tree with no trunk, no life forms earlier than the already very complex ones in Cambrian rocks, and no branches, no transitional forms can hardly be called a tree at all. This problem presented by the lack of transitional forms in the fossil record also extends to the lack of transitional forms observable in nature or even conceivable in the human mind. Evolutionists are unable not only to point to the specific form observed by scientists as an indisputable transitional form, but also to present a reasonable explanation for the survival of any hypothetical transition forms in nature. Since many forms would be useless until fully developed. Evolution demands that mutations be beneficial to cause them to be reproduced and become dominant in nature, and yet half developed transitional forms provide no clear advantage. On the contrary, they are more likely to be handicaps, Brown elaborates. If a limb were to evolve into a wing, it would become a bad limb long before it became a good wing. Again, beneath the current of debate, we find the teleological argument to be among the best answers to evolutionists and the strongest support for creationism. It is clear that God, as designer, provides a much better explanation for the design evidence by life than does a theory that requires transitional forms guided by natural selection. The fossil record, the observation of living organisms, and the teleological nature of numerous forms testify to the impossibility of gradual change. Yet gradual change is absolutely critical to traditional evolutionary theory. Darwin himself admits, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. This is precisely what creationists have claimed for years, that Darwin's evolutionary theory is bankrupt. Reason requires the biologist to abandon evolution and embrace the more rational explanation, creation. Of course, creationism is untenable for all atheists. Therefore, even if atheists recognize the irrationality of transitional evolutionary theory, they must postulate an equally indefensible theory to circumvent the notion of God. Punctuated equilibrium. Thus, evolutionists recently have suggested the theory of punctuated equilibrium. This theory allows the materialistic evolutionists to escape some of the inconsistency of neo-Darwinian evolution while ignoring the possibility of the existence of God. Punctuated equilibrium claims that evolution occurs in spurts in relatively short periods of time, which supposedly accounts for the absence of transitional forms. Stephen Jay Gould is the theory's leading proponent, largely because he recognizes the untenability of any evolutionary theory that requires gradual intermediate change, but is still unwilling to abandon the theory of evolution. This forces him to postulate an alternative evolutionary theory custom built to fit the facts. Unfortunately for evolutionists, this approach still faces severe problems. Punctuated equilibrium continues to rely on the Darwinian mechanisms of natural selection and survival of the fittest, but at a much faster pace than Darwin would allow and is isolated segments of a species population. The problem with explaining punctuated equilibrium based on Darwinian mechanisms, even if the mechanisms were viable, is that Darwin explicitly declared that they must work gradually, imperceptibly, not rapidly and obviously. The biggest problem with punctuated equilibrium, however, is that it is not based on evidence. Instead, it is assumed to be the correct explanation because it fits the lack of empirical evidence. But this is a logical assumption. The lack of evidence for one proposed method of evolution does not necessarily provide the veracity of another proposed method. It might instead be interpreted as evidence that evolution simply did not occur. As Origen's theory that cannot postulate a satisfactory mechanism, but rather is based on the absence of evidence, is no better than its parent theory, Neo Darwinism. Further, the speculations of punctuated equilibrium may avoid the problem of transitional forms, but they are faced with the insurmountable problems presented by spontaneous generation, the lack of observed beneficial mutations, and evolution's contradiction of the second law of thermodynamics. Punctuated equilibrium, then, is every bit as faulty as traditional evolutionary theory. Creationism proves to be a much better explanation of man's origin. When one takes into account evidence of intelligent design throughout the universe, the complexity and ingenuity of DNA, the fossil record showing no transitional forms, but rather kind begetting kind, the extinction of species rather than new species evolving through natural selection or punctuated equilibrium, the law of biogenesis, and the second law of thermodynamics. Conclusion: evolutionary theory has come full circle. From an assumption of the gradual appearance of all species to an assumption of the virtually instantaneous, geologically speaking, appearance of all species. From the Christian biologist's perspective, this is an interesting turn of events. It suggests that the evolutionists' faith in evolution is so unshakable they are willing to believe any theory that they can twist to fit the facts, or absence of facts. The belief that God created all things, including man, in his own image, requires faith. But evolutionary theory requires more faith since evolution runs contrary to reason, science, and history. Still, many evolutionists hold desperately to their theory simply because it is the only explanation of origins that excludes God. The scientists who believe that everything can be explained in natural terms cannot tolerate the concept of a supernatural being. But for the Christian biologist, the world is only comprehensible in light of God's existence. Ironically, it was Darwin's wife who eloquently verbalized the creationist remonstrance to evolutionists. In a letter her husband, she wrote, "May not the habit in scientific pursuits of believing nothing till it is proved influence your mind too much in other things which cannot be proved in the same way, and which, if true, are likely to be above our comprehension."